30th at 7:01. If everyone will please stand for the pledges. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible. Okay, before we move to citizens' comments, I would like to welcome Christian to the Board of Adjustments. This is his first meeting. Christian will kind of go over a few of the rules of what we can and can't do when Mr. Coker stands up, just so you're not totally lost. But please ask any questions that you need to ask. Okay, citizens' comments. Did we have anyone wanting to speak? Okay, no citizens' comments. Item number 4.1, approval of the minutes from the June 14th Board of Adjustments meeting. Are there any additions, corrections, or comments? I'll entertain a motion. Christian motion. Do I have a second? Second. Herb, all in favor? Aye. All right, item number 5.1. Hold a public hearing on the request of Pamela C. Bazzell, requesting a variance to locational requirements for accessory structures, specifically to construct 2 accessory structures in the front yard of a primary residential structure, and secondly, the ability to construct 2 accessory structures within the 100-year floodplain, contrary to the decision of the city's flood plan administrator. The property location is described as Frontier Meadows, Lot 10, property ID 16633, Lot 11, property ID 16634, Lot 25, property ID 16648, and Lot 26, property ID 16649, specifically located at 100 Serene Haven. So at this time for the public hearing, I will ask anyone that is here to speak for the variance to please step forward and turn on the microphone.
That would be you.
Me. She wouldn't go under items for consideration?
Well, let me talk to the board for a second. Public hearing is when the applicant and the public has the opportunity to say what they want to say. And then for the deliberations, you should close the public hearing, and that's
do it then.
That's up to you all.
Okay. So please identify yourself and give your address.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. The reason we're asking for it to be a little bit...
Can we have your name and address, please?
I'm sorry?
Your name and address.
Oh, I'm Pamela C. Bazzell, and I own the property. And the reason I'm asking for a variance as far as the 2 properties to be kind of on the side of the property instead of in the back is because the entire back of the property is a floodplain. I cannot put anything back there. So I'm putting it right on the edge of the floodplain. So it's actually just a little bit in the floodplain. It has to be built up about 1.5 feet. And that's it. And then that way it won't be too far forward. If I go forward with it much more, I have to tear down a bunch of trees. And I didn't want to do that. As well as it just was kind of where the neighbors wouldn't be bothered by it because it's just a storage building for like our lawnmowers. It's 26 acres, so it needs a lot of care. Tractors, lawnmowers, the whole bit. And so all that to say, and then I also have, I want to put a barn on there because we want to have 4 horses. And, I'm sorry? A horse barn, yeah, 4 horses. But like I said, we were keeping it back. If you, on that document, it kind of shows where it's at. I would prefer it be in the back, but it would be really in the floodplain, like the floodplain, which I don't think it'd be healthy for the floodplain, and it wouldn't be healthy, you know what I'm saying? It wouldn't be healthy for anything, in my opinion. So we were just keeping it back far enough that it wasn't kind of visible much at all from the road, and also so we wouldn't have to tear down the trees and cut down all the trees. And because I didn't want it to be, it's not going to be unattractive because it's going to be a very nice barn and a very nice storage building. The storage building is actually going to sit behind the barn. So the barn would be what you see. And then I'm also, this has nothing to do with the plat though. Right, exactly. So I don't know if there's anything else I should say, Mike? Okay. Okay, cool. Thank you for letting me address you.
Anyone else to speak for the variance?
So you already had mine.
Anyone here to speak against the variance? Okay, I will close the public hearing at 7:07 and reopen our regular meeting. Item number 6.1, items for consideration. Consider the request of Pamela C. Bazzell for a variance to locational requirements for accessory structures, specifically to construct 2 accessory structures in the front yard of a primary residential structure, and secondly, the ability to construct 2 accessory structures within the 100-year floodplain, contrary to the decision of the city's floodplain administrator. And Mr. Coker, before you speak, I will share with the board that we received 5 responses from neighbors, 2 on Frontier Trail that are both in favor of the request with no comments, 2 on Arezzo Lane that are opposed with no comments, and 1 with comments. And the comments are unorthodox and unsightly, the equivalent of putting a work shed in your front yard. That's why we have ordinances. Also increases in construction noise and traffic, future air pollution considerations. So Mr. Coker, will you please address the board?
Madam Chair, members of the board, Michael Coker representing the city in this case. You've got 2 requests in front of you. The first request is to build a accessory structure, in this case 2, in front of the primary residence. Do you have access to bring any of this stuff up in there? Okay. If you look at the documents that I gave you, there's a site plan that shows the 2 properties outlined in the 2 proposed accessory structures outlined in red. You see that? And then outlined in blue is where the main house is. This property is comprised today of 4 separate lots. And in reality, if it were to remain 4 separate lots, she couldn't build accessory structures on it at all because accessory structures have to be coincident with the main structure to start with. But coming up on the 9th of September, she has requested a replat of the 4 lots into 1 lot. And I felt like, given that that was where we were headed, it made sense for the board to have the opportunity to consider this as though it were 1 lot, because Board of Adjustment, you're basically legislative, but a replat of the 4 lots into 1 lot is basically ministerial. If it conforms with the regulations, it's got to be approved. And I've done the review on it. It conforms with the regulations. So when the Planning and Zoning Commission gets it, they're going to recommend approval unless something comes off the rails that I'm not aware of, and it will go to council and be approved. So it'll end up being 1 lot. I want you to consider it as though it were 1 lot today. So the first thing that you need to consider is, does it make sense to allow 2 new accessory structures, still in the floodplain, but on the area between Frontier Trail, where it has turned more or less westerly, it's kind of a big U, and if you come in off of League on the easternmost side, coming more or less northerly, you end up going to the Bazzell driveway, and then Frontier Trail, still a dirt, crummy road, turns to the west, And as you get down toward, not all the way to the next turn, but just before it makes another left-hand turn to go back toward Lee, and you look off to the right, that is back behind the trees is where she's trying to put these two accessory structures. The form boards are up. The form boards are up. So I went by and looked at it again today, and there's nothing being built, but the form boards are up, so I know exactly where it's at. I've had her surveyor put them accurately on the plan that you have in front of you. And the replat, when it comes to the city council, will show the form board locations, should you choose to approve this. I've reviewed the application as it relates to this first request, and I've asked you to deal with them in this order, because if you don't approve the first one, then the second one's irrelevant. So the first one is to allow construction of an accessory structure in the front yard, basically, where the code requires that it be in the backyard. Well, in the backyard of this property, not only is it all in the floodplain, but it's in the backyard, it's also a floodway easement. You may not build anything in a floodway easement. It's reflected on the survey, it's reflected on our plat. The rules are pretty specific. You can't build it. You can build in the floodplain subject to certain compliance with certain things. And when you get to the second issue, I've recommended that if you approve the first variance, then I'm recommending that you approve the second variance. However, if you were to approve the second variance, and that is to build this in the floodplain, I want her to comply with the floodplain regulations. And not only do they require that they require an engineer to certify that the finished floor elevation is 2 feet above the floodplain level. Not just at the floodplain level, but 2 feet above that, which will mean that there'll be kind of a drive approach and some other things. One of the things that she'll have to prove, should you agree with this, is that there is no upstream increase in the flood level as a result of this construction. Now, I've done hundreds of these all over the state, and I would be amazed if there was any incremental increase as a result of these two small accessory structures being built in the floodplain. With that said, Madam Chair, I'm glad to answer any questions that you might have regarding this case, but I do want you to take them the first request first, which is to build in between the right-of-way, the street right-of-way, and the front of the house, because that would be the new front yard. And then take the second one, which is the request to be allowed to build in the floodplain.
What are the? I just wanted to know what the footprint of the buildings were, size-wise. I see it on here, but I can't read it.
I can't either. So let me pull it up on my computer.
Just rough.
Oh, yeah. But if you've got the plans there, just come to the mic and introduce yourself. This is not part of the public hearing. This is answering questions. And give us the footprint of the two buildings. The one in the back, the furthest back one, and then the front one.
My name is Larry Robinson. I'll be the one constructing the buildings. So the actual storage building is 30 by 50.
Which one's the storage building?
It would be the one sitting farthest back to the trees, beside the pond. And what else was you asking? I'm sorry.
The size of the other building.
Okay, and then 54 by 72.
Okay, thank you.
54 by 72 is the horse one.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, the barn.
Where the horses are living.
Yes, ma'am.
And I was able to get it big enough on my screen that I could read that too.
I could see it on here. I just
I'm
couldn't
with
make it
you.
out. Sorry, thank you.
I got it at 400% on my screen.
My eyes won't do that.
So my question is, on this drawing that we have, where is Serene? house address?
It's in that, you see the blue kind of trapezoidal shape? That has, it says Zone X, Loma 0906 2165A. That's where the house is.
Yeah, I know where the house is. I just want to know where Serene Haven.
Oh, Serene Haven doesn't exist.
Sure does. It's his address.
Well,
It's their address.
it's
It has to
it's the
exist.
drive, it's the
Okay,
driveway.
it's still, it's their address. It exists.
On the right side of the house.
And it is on the CAD.
And it is. If you take a look at that same graphic and you drive out where, and you look at where it says FEMA designated floodplain, there's an arrow, and you go to make to the right of that, and it says place, something beginning. That's the beginning of Serene Haven, that 15-foot driveway.
I thought that's where it was. I just wanted to make sure.
That's where the address takes you to.
Okay, so I need to clarify something you said.
Yes, ma'am.
You said if they didn't bring all 4 pieces of these property into one, it would not be allowed. But if they bring it all into one, it can be allowed with a variance even though it's in front of the residence?
It requires a variance if
It
you're going to build
requires
it
a
in the front
variance.
yard.
Got it.
In the front yard. And it's an interesting dichotomy because it says, the ordinance says in the front yard. In the front yard for this zoning district is maybe 100 feet, but because this says, it doesn't say front yard setback, it says front yard, then you can't build in front of the house without coming to the board and asking for permission. Based on my review of this, I don't think this poses any threat to the community. I think it conforms with all of the requirements that you need to take into consideration when you're considering this application.
I had a quick question.
The man is electric.
So for the 100-year floodplain,
Yes.
do we have any data on when the last time that area flooded?
I don't.
Okay, so it is at least likely every 100 years at most frequency at which the area
Well,
floods.
the interesting thing about the 100-year floodplain is it can flood every year. But based on the frequency of the kinds of events that occur at this location, the best guess is once every 100 years. But if it were to flood every year to this same elevation, this would still keep these new improvements, as well as the main house, out of where that water would come. So the frequency is, the guesstimate by the federal government is that it might flood based on the environment every 100 years. We've had the last 2 or 3 years, we've had so much rain, I'd be surprised if we didn't have significant water levels in that creek 2 or 3 times a year. So I can't answer the question about when it flooded last that we knew about, but the federal government has said if it were to flood every year at this elevation and it were built 2 feet above that elevation, that property would be safe. Does that make sense? It's up to the chair.
I was going to actually ask if the homeowners had any evidence or experiences with flooding on the property.
Have you experienced any flooding on the property since you lived there? Because you just lived there a short time.
As bad as this year has been, it goes back in the creek and flows right through. I don't, they just really haven't determined lately that it's really still in the flood. I don't even think this property is in the flood where we're at. But they say it could in 100 years, but it's been a bad year at all.
It is in the floodplain, ma'am. I guarantee you.
Well, I mean, what I'm saying is for it to be this bad this year and not have any flooding, well, there's got to be a limit. I mean, this has been a hazardous year. I would have thought that it's going to flood to be rehabilitated. And so, and then we did have the surveyor come out, and he will come back out and we built it up to the level we need it at, and
different things here. One of them is whether it's gonna flood your building or not, but the other part of it is whether it's going to create a dam, so to speak, there that will back the water up and flood behind it, upstream from it. So that's part of why they don't want you building in there. It's not, they care less whether your building floods or not, really, but it's the fact of whether it's going to back it up and cause other people problems.
One thing is, we can pull it forward, but then it would be more obtrusive to the
Right.
around. I was trying to keep it as far back as possible.
Sure.
And it's really on the edge, because the barn is only a little bit up in the floodplain. The barn is partially out of it. And so,
Whereas you got the creek on the left side, and when you go into the heavy creek on the back side, we stuck it kind of on the pond in the creek, we stuck it in between that, so any water, not shedding, any water still going straight to the back of the creek.
and the property, we talking about the property, that house that we're in, that is way above floodplain. And it's no longer considered new floodplain.
Yeah.
Outside of floodplain.
Yeah, you can certainly raise the ground level up and get it out of there.
They built it up.
Right.
And really, this one is pretty much supposed to do that. That's why we thought, well, this might be an ideal place, and like I said, farther enough back, that it's not moderated. You know what I'm saying? The only other option would be to build a house in front and then build our properties, but, but if we own all the land, don't make it one and build houses on it and put, but then leaving the houses out. So I'd rather not, it's gonna be so far back that no one's gonna pretty much see it, which is what I was trying to do. I don't wanna make the area worse, I want to improve it, I don't wanna make it worse.
Any other questions?
Mr. Coker, can you clarify on page 11, the map showing the two red marked structures?
Yes, sir.
The line that's marked FEMA designated floodplain appears to be well to the east of the building, but the applicant said that it was right on the edge or not even completely in the plane. Can you explain the discrepancy between those explanations?
Yes, sir.
Descriptions?
The FEMA designated floodplain is actually what's on the firm map. It was updated in 2008. So, and it's the official map for this part of McLendon-Chisholm. There was a flood research paper done for Sonoma Verde that extra dotted line that kind of comes down and shows that the floodplain changed somewhat was done by a third-party engineering firm, very competent, but not approved by FEMA, and so I'm obligated to use what the Federal Emergency Management Agency shows, and that is what I've labeled on this graphic. And if we wanted, not we, if the applicant wanted to, she could try and get the federal FEMA to accept that revision, but they haven't done that. Much like the trapezoid, the blue trapezoid, where Nathan brought his footprint out of the floodplain, went through all the engineering and proved it up, and I put it in your packet, and FEMA said, you're right, it doesn't have any adverse effect upstream, and so we're going to approve this, and he did. That hasn't happened with this alternative line that has part of that southeasternmost part of the building out of the floodplain. I can't use that because it was not approved by FEMA. I can only use what FEMA has said. And so in that case, even though the ground level where she's proposing the two accessory structures may be higher than further to the north, it's still going to require that if the board were to approve it, that it is built 2 feet above the finished floor elevation has to be 2 feet above that floodplain level, whatever that number is. Okay?
Also, the next page, 12, with the colored photograph for illustration, is a much narrower band, and that's what you're referring to. It appears that that might be the edge that applicant is referring to.
Say it again, Gary.
The blue flood zone on page 12 appears to align with the location that the applicant described.
It could be. I've stuck this in here because this is a copy of the actual firm map for that area.
Okay. And my last question is,
In my geography, I wasn't able to paste the site plan on top of this.
in your rationale for approval, did the scale of these properties have anything to do with your decision? If this were scaled down to 4 or 5 acres, would you be so amenable to this approval? If the sight lines were proportionately closer to the road and that sort of thing? Did the scale of the current properties have anything to do with your tendency to approve it?
I understand the question, and the answer is, based on the requirements that you need to take into account, are the things that I evaluated this application in. Will it have an adverse effect on the neighbors? There's 9 things that you have to consider when you're making a decision about this. I went through those 9 things, and I thought, this fits all that. So it's not really the scale, not really the size of the buildings, but how did it fit into the requirements that the board needs to consider before you make a decision. So I didn't scale what had nothing to do with it, although I would say that a 52 by 76 foot barn on 4 acres is probably not out of scale if you got a horse barn, because 4 acres is a lot of dirt.
But if it were in the front yard.
Well, that would change it up, and that's why they're in front of the board, not in front of Mike. Because, of course, I'd be held to the same standard that you would be held to, but you need to make the consideration: does this make sense in the context of the 9 review criteria that you're held to?
Do we have an approximate distance from the barn to the road, Frontier Trail?
Yeah, I can actually see that. I've got it here. It's on the map. If he gets it up before I can get my size up here.
I think I see a dimension, but it's
209. The nearest point to Frontier Trail right away is 290.8 feet.
I see the 90, okay.
290.8, and then the other side is 297, because it's not perfectly parallel to the right-of-way. So it's 290.8 feet from the northeastern corner of that particular one to the right-of-way for Frontier Trail.
Thank you. And are both of the buildings west of the pond?
Mr. Coker, I have a question that if the first variance would be approved, when it comes to the second variance about the floodplain, it's, correct me if I'm wrong, they would have to go to FEMA and do everything that FEMA said for it to be allowed before a building permit can be issued.
Actually, they have to conform with the section in our code which deals with floodplains, and it has some real specific language. They have to do the engineering, they have to prove that they can build it. It's not going to, I don't think that they're obligated under our ordinance to go to FEMA. I think they're, under our ordinance, they're obligated to do this stuff and prove that it's not going to do the stuff that FEMA would require that they not do. So
when the house was built and the owner at the time went to FEMA and proved to do that, he didn't have to?
yes, he did.
For a home?
Well, I would say that based on my understanding of the requirements for filling in the floodplain, you have to get a letter of map revision, a LOMER, in order to pull that up. And if she were to do all of the things that our ordinance requires, she would have satisfied the requirements for FEMA. And I would suggest that a condition is to not only comply with our ordinance, but to comply with whatever requirements the federal government has for construction in the flood.
Any other questions for Mr. Coker or the applicant? Sure.
Oh, no, there we go. Sorry. She told me I needed to come up here if I have a question. Whoops. Are you saying I'll have to go through all the FEMA thing because it can take a long, long time? And if that's the case, I want to pull it forward out of the floodplain. I don't want to do all that I don't want to take a year. You know what? I'm old. My prior husband is deceased and life is short. And I moved here to have a wonderful home and a wonderful neighborhood.
Well, basically what I heard Mr. Coker say, and he can correct me, is that the board can put in the variance request, if it's approved, that you do everything the city requires and FEMA.
And
So
if that's the case, I want to move it forward. I'm not going to wait 2 years to do this. I'm not. I'm just not. Like I said, life is too long for this, or too short, and I don't.
Okay, not knowing how the board is going to vote tonight,
Yeah.
would you like to withdraw your request and represent it? You have that option.
I don't know, Mike. I don't know.
Under any set of circumstances, that if you're going to build accessory structures between the right-of-way for the street and the front of the main house, you have to get a variance from the board.
You would have to get a variance for that, correct?
Right.
But if you're not going to be in the floodplain,
Then
you do
don't
not have to
fight
have the
that.
second variance, right? Am I correct?
That's
So-
I actually thought that Lisa, when I talked to Lisa, she recommended I keep it where it was because I already had said that to her. Should I just move it out of the floodplain? And she said, no, don't tear down a bunch more trees to get it forward. Plus, it would be better back where nobody sees it. I don't want to be the neighbor that everybody hates. You know, there's a barn there. So I understand. I'm doing what I would want my neighbor to do. And so, but I don't want to wait 2 years for FEMA. You know, I don't.
Ma'am, I understand that.
Yeah.
We are obligated to do what we need to do with the city rules and the government rules that we are upholding.
Yeah.
So I understand that it
Right.
might take 2 years, but that is really out of our hands.
Yeah. Well, but I was under the understanding that the FEMA thing is something that is not required necessarily. That would be just something that you guys may decide that you want to require.
And we are within our right to do that.
Yes, I know. And I'm begging you not to because it's just so much time. And that's all I'm thinking.
How far forward? How far forward?
Well,
would
I'd
you
have to
bring?
come probably, well, however big those things are, probably another 100 feet, 125 feet, yeah. Because
Yeah,
you've got
it's hard to tell on here.
yeah,
where
the
the
two
line is.
buildings, because the building's like 50 feet, and then there's, you know, footage in between it, and then there's probably another 50 feet of that building of the barn that's in the floodplain, but probably 20 feet of it is not. So that would mean we'd have to move it 100 feet forward.
Well, if you're back 20 feet of that back barn is in it, or in the, are you talking about the shed or the barn?
The shed, the
Okay,
shed.
If it's 20 feet, then all you'd have to do is move both buildings 20 feet forward.
No, we're actually, the back one is completely in the floodplain.
Oh,
Sir, the recording's not going to pick you up. It's not in the microphone.
You would probably have about 80 feet from the road to the barn, and then it would start the process what you've got far as the layout. So you'd have 80 feet.
Instead of 200.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm just trying to see how far.
I'm sorry?
I was just trying to see how far
Yeah.
forward you.
It's going to be a lot further up, and I just, like I said, I just thought,
Sure. Yeah, I just
you know, I'm thinking aesthetically.
understand. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Madam Chair, the public comments that we received, are they related to possible upstream flood risk or the possible flood concerns in general?
Well, I really can't address except the one that had comments, and the first comment is unorthodox and unsightly. So to me, I interpret that as they don't want to blind. The others, there are no comments that are opposed, they just not opposed. Unless we're mind readers. We can't do it.
Are these structures screened by trees at all? Are the structures screened by trees at all? Someone mentioned there were trees in front of it from the road.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
It's not really visible. It's behind the trees.
Correct.
I just wanted, because they said it was unsightly and orthodox, I wanted to see.
Are they evergreen trees, or do the leaves drop?
How tall are the structures? Did we get that? How tall the structures are? Yes.
The barn, the 14-foot, the sidewalls would be 14 foot. On the storage building, the sidewalls would be 16 foot. But the barn, with its peak, it would cover the storage barn. The storage barn being up like that for the motor home to pull in there, we have to have 14 foot in the clear.
Are they wood structures?
No,
or
sir.
metal, or-
No, sir. All I-beam construction, 26 gauge sheet metal, 50-year warranty. I mean, that's,
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions for Mr. Coker or the applicant? Okay, we are only going to act on the first variance. We're going to act on them one at a time. The first variance is to, on the location of the proposed accessory structures. Do I have a motion?
Make a motion to adopt, allow it. It's written.
Okay, I have a motion to approve the variance. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second.
Madam Chair, before you take the vote, would you allow me a moment?
Yes.
If you're going to approve the locational variance, please make the condition that it comply with the attached site plan as shown with the two red outlines, so that we know where it's going to be.
Would you like to reword your variance? Reword your motion.
I'd like to make a motion to approve it with the buildings located as they are indicated on the plat that we were provided, in that position and the size that they were mentioned, plus the weight method of construction.
Okay, we have a new motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second that one.
I have a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Nay. So we have 4 approved and 1 nay. Okay, this variance passes with 4 approvals. We will move to the second variance, which is on the location of the buildings in the floodplain. I will remind the board that if you make a motion to approve this, it must be subject to the following conditions. The applicant provides documentation from a registered professional engineer that shows that the addition of the two structures within Zone A, as identified on the FEMA map, will not increase the water level during the 100-year flood event. The applicant applies for the required floodplain development permit. The applicant provides designs for the accessory buildings that conform to the requirements of sections 3.04.063 and 3.04.092 of the City of McLendon-Chisholm Code of Ordinance. You may also add the stipulation on gaining FEMA approval. Turn your mic on.
Mike. And maybe it is a question for you, actually. FEMA compliance is not necessarily FEMA approval, right? Is it?
Say the question.
If you comply with FEMA, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to get FEMA approval if you're compliant.
Well,
You can be compliant without being approved.
That's right. You could make an application that conforms to all the requirements and still not be approved by FEMA.
But you can still.
But if you go through that process, now I'm going to be honest with you, I've gone through that process a couple hundred times, and there have been some times when FEMA just said, no, we're not going to allow you to do what you want to do. But most of the time, the answer's been yes, and we've changed, even when we've had upstream increases in flood level as a result of it. It was microscopic kind of floodplain increases, so it had no adverse effect. But compliance is one thing, but approval is something altogether. And I believe that what the chair is saying, that in order to build these two accessory structures in the floodplain, that were this motion to be made, it would include approval by FEMA for a letter of map revision.
But they effectively being compliant satisfies that even if you don't seek approval.
Well, and I think that's
Or
the
is it
reason
necessary?
our ordinance is written the way it is. Our ordinance does not require that they get a loan or that they go to FEMA. It says, if you do all this stuff, then the floodplain administrator can accept and approve the development permit in the floodplain. And I gave you what our ordinance required. I didn't put anything extra in there.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Any other questions on the second variance request?
Mr. Coker, on page 11, although that's part of the case for the first request, it has an item marked approximate location of flowage easement over on the left side of the center line of the property. Is that what you would consider to be the main channel, the lowest elevation? And can we approximate, or do we have the dimension from that point to the nearest structure? And is there any topographic map showing the grade at that point from between?
That's the piece you were talking about that runs behind the house, eliminating them the option to build behind the house. That's what I thought.
And would it be safe to say that the two accessory structures are in the wake of the elevated pad for the residence? It's downstream in the same general line, though. That was a poor choice of words. So if the house was built up to circumvent the restriction for building in that area, and that didn't cause a concern for FEMA, then can we deduce from that that two smaller buildings would have no more effect?
I think that that's a reasonable deduction.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions on the second variance?
I do have one more question. I don't see their pond on this. Is it sort of the creek on one side and the pond on the other?
And the answer is yes. The creek is on one side, and it's a good-sized pond is on the other side. And the pond is between where these accessory structures are and where the house is.
So the pond is on lot 10?
And part of lot 25, I think.
That's kind of, okay. So it kind of, that's where the, okay.
So it'll sort of sieve either way. I
Yes,
imagine.
that's correct.
Yes.
And because the pond is where the pond is, if water, like we were talking about, if we had flood waters that came around the house, heading more or less southwest, they might go right across and through that pond on their way down to the creek. Which would probably do a lot of damage to their fountain.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah, we'll entertain a motion.
Can the motion be written to exclude the necessity of having the FEMA approval?
Yes, sir.
Would it be stated as a
No.
conclusion?
It would just be the bullet points that Mr. Coker gave us for the approval.
Page
9.
I move that we approve the variance number 2, subject to the conditions stated. Do you want me to read all 3 of them? Bullet number 1, the applicant provides documentation from a registered professional engineer that shows the addition of 2 structures within Zone A, as identified by the FEMA map, will not increase the water level during the 100-year flood event. Second, the applicant applies for the required floodplain development permit. And third, the applicant provides designs for the accessory buildings that conform to the requirements of sections 3.04.063 and 3.04.092 of the City of McLendon-Chisholm Code of Ordinances, without reference to the FEMA requirements.
Okay, I have a motion. Do I have a second? I have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Nay? Richard?
Nay.
No. Are we okay? 3, 4, 2 against, are we okay? The motion failed. Okay, that's what I thought. Because it has to be it has to be 4 to 1.
It takes 4 affirmative votes to approve a variance. And if the vote is 3, 4, and 2 against, then the motion fails.
Okay, so the applicant's options now.
Well, that's a whole
Another can of
whole
worms.
different application.
Okay. That would be if the motion had been made to deny it without prejudice, they could have come back with a different plan, but the motion wasn't made to deny it. The motion to approve it failed. So they just have to come back with a second plan, correct?
And, well, and the board has the authority to entertain a different motion, a motion that would replace the motion that failed, were you of a mind to do so. I'm not recommending that you do that. I'm just saying that the rules will allow you to consider an alternative motion, one that might, for instance, include FEMA requirements. I think that that's not what the board just voted on, and so it may be a non-starter. If you're done with this, there's some discussion that we can have, but I think that it's not relevant to the case at hand. I think that the board's decision with a 3-2 vote effectively denies the ability for a variance. What you have done, on the other hand, is approve the locations as shown. Now I'm going to segue for a second into what the city of McLendon-Chisholm ordinance actually says. Okay? What the ordinance actually says is the floodplain administrator, who is Lisa. She's the city administrator. And this is one of those things. She doesn't have the alternative to assign it to Mike or to assign it to Doug. She is, by ordinance, the floodplain administrator. If the floodplain administrator said that based on the conditions that Gary just read into the record, she could say, I can approve this because this ordinance says that she can approve it. And now that the board has said that accessory structures in the front yard are acceptable at this location for this, because it's not setting a precedent, just for this one case, she could actually petition the floodplain administrator, not for a variance, but for a floodplain permit that conforms with the requirements of the code. Are you with? Am I making sense there? So you asked the question about what are the options. I think those are the options. The last and final option that an applicant has is that if they don't like the decision of the board, they can appeal that decision within 10 work days to a court at the county or district level. And they can appeal your decision and the basis for your denial. Okay? That, if you think a 2-year FEMA time frame is long, you really will be old by the time you get done with the court.
May I say that I said to Lisa, I just want to get the buildings built. So, because we need this, right now we have trailers and tractors and out there that we need for the 26 acres and taking care of it. And so I said, should I just move it forward and be done with it? And she's the one that said, no, let's leave it back and not tear the trees down. And like you said, it would be more pleasant for the neighbors. So I would have come the other way if I'd have thought that it was going to be turned down. I'm not trying to cause problems. I was told when I bought the land that they were building a barn and there was no problem. Evidently that wasn't true. So I didn't know. I guess I'm stupid for trusting someone that I felt like was honest, but evidently they weren't. But I didn't know that. And so here I sit with a situation that, like I said, I just need a building to put my stuff in so we don't have to have it parked out on the side of the house. It looks terrible right now. I don't like it. It's not pretty. It's not, it looks like a lot of our neighbors that nobody's doing anything about. You know what I'm saying? But yet they want to make me not do anything. It's really kind of sad. Because if you drove that neighborhood and I showed you what I'm talking about, you'd be like, this is a great idea. Okay, but my neighbors have 18-wheelers sitting out there on the road overnight.
Madam Chair, the public hearing is over.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
The public hearing is over. You really shouldn't be speaking now.
I'm sorry.
That's
Let me
okay.
quit talking.
That's okay.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so
Madam Chair, before you drop your gavel,
I'm not doing that yet.
okay, I'm going to recommend that based on the board's approval of the first variance, which was the location of the two accessory structures, that the applicant in this case, given the fact that the board failed to approve the second variance, that the applicant in this case petition the subdivision administrator with new facts about the potential for obtaining a floodplain development permit in accordance with the guidance provided in our ordinance.
Okay, but we also have the option to accept a second motion from the board, correct?
Yes, you do. Absolutely.
Okay. Do I hear a second motion?
So I guess I could make a motion that would approve the second variance with 3 previous stipulated bullet points, but that the applicant will at least submit an LOMR to FEMA. May not be conditional on FEMA's approval for the structure, but there at least will be a submission to FEMA of a proposed LOMR.
Just for clarification, what you're asking for is for her not to just make application, but it's the discussion that we had earlier, that this LOMR, this request for a letter of map revision be approved by FEMA. Is that what you're asking for?
No, that's not. He's just asking for a submission. He didn't
Okay.
ask for
I got it.
approval.
Okay.
Right?
Thank you for
Did I hear
clarifying.
that right?
Okay, thank you
Okay.
for clarifying that.
So we have a motion on the table for the 3 previously stated bullets with the addition of a 4th one to submit an LOMR to FEMA, but does not have to be accepted by FEMA.
Approved.
Approved by FEMA. Approved by FEMA. Okay, so I have a second motion made by Christian. Do I have a second?
I have a question.
Okay.
Just to be clear, so this is what I was talking about with the compliance, that they're going for compliance but not necessarily approval. Is that what your motion is?
More or less, but I think that there's something to be said about trying to the best of our ability to comply to at least the LOMR portion of the FEMA approval process.
I just wanted to be clear.
Are we having a discussion at this point?
We can't have a discussion until I get a second. But you can second the motion and not vote for it.
All right, I'll second it because I have a question.
Okay, I have a second. Now we can discuss it.
Explain the rationale that you just, of the motion you just made, why it's desirable to have another bullet point added that's not going to be complied with.
So I recognize that from the homeowner's perspective, the burden of getting the process approved through FEMA may take many months, possibly years. Ultimately, though, the approval of the LOMR is intended to demonstrate from FEMA's perspective that there will not be any upstream effects with the floodplain or any floodplain changes or any effects in which the property itself is not conforming to the floodplain regulations. So by at least submitting an LOMR, not only does that demonstrate that the applicant would have gone through the first 3 bullets successfully, but it at least also demonstrates an intentionality to comply with FEMA standards for the property. And the reason why I was personally concerned with voting for the first motion was that lack of FEMA approval, because it is very serious to be building on floodplain.
You don't have still have lack of approval in your motion.
I do, and I recognize that.
What's the difference?
But
You can't expect the applicant to submit a request and then proceed with construction while it's hanging.
well, assuming that the request is, assuming that the applicant has followed through the first 3 bullets, then it is very likely that the applicant will be able to successfully navigate the LOMR process.
No, it's not obvious at all.
I mean, say, what happens if they submit and FEMA's not?
Denied.
The motion isn't asking for approval by FEMA, so all he's asking for is a submission. as they
FEMA.
met, as long as they met our ordinance on building in the floodplain, it's okay, correct, Mr. Coker?
That's correct, based on the motion that you're considering right now. I believe that board member Bazzell has said that all you gotta do is make out. You all, 1 through 3, and that establishes the standard that you need to make the application to for whether it matters. That gets you there. Once you make that admission, and you're not, I don't think you're held up on getting the building, because our code says that if you do 1 through 3, then the subdivision administrator may issue a development.
Are you saying that FEMA has no teeth then?
Right, right.
In this case, I'm saying.
In this case, right. And all, I believe, all that Christian is asking for is a good faith effort to submit.
And I don't, well, I don't dislike that motion. I think what that does, it provides essentially the opportunity for the applicant to go through the first 3 steps of our code, get that application, and then if the subdivision administrator issues the development, we go get a building permit and go through.
May I address the applicant? Given what you've heard just now, would you be inclined to proceed with the FEMA application, not knowing what the outcome of that would be?
Well, my question, though, still would be, are you saying, though, that I don't want FEMA to tell us to tear the buildings down after spending the money? I mean, are we sure that would not happen?
That's my concern too. I don't have any background to answer that question. I'm relying on Mr. Coker.
FEMA does not have the authority to direct the building official for the city of McLendon-Chisholm to require the demolition of a building that is not approved in the floodplain.
Then what benefit do they serve to have us put that in the motion?
It is just a good faith action on the applicant's part to submit to FEMA. That's all it is.
Back to you.
I have no problem doing any of that, if it's just paperwork or whatever.
If these are your choices, do you want the board to approve the
You
second
can't
motion?
ask that question, Mr. Nickel.
Are you-
I'm sorry.
are
You
you
cannot ask
prepared-
that question.
Are you prepared to go ahead with your plan if the second motion is approved?
With the 2 buildings being built where they're at, is that what you're asking, Gary? Yes, I would love to be able to do that. I think it's the best location. I think if you all went out there, I think you would agree with me.
I'm not arguing that.
Yeah.
That was the
So,
first
yes, I
variance.
would love
The
to go
second variance
forward.
is whether you're going to submit the 4th bullet, comply with the 4th bullet point.
Yes, just submitting it to FEMA,
Yeah.
that would be no problem for me.
You're aware of what effort that takes and what that involves? I'm not.
I don't think it's that big of a deal because I actually have a mortgage company and we actually send stuff in and it gets changed and corrected all the time.
Okay.
So it's actually not as big a deal as you think.
All right.
My only thing is if they say, well, no, that wouldn't work, or it's not okay, we don't love that, and we're not going to take it out of the floodplain. Does that make sense? Normally, all they do is say, it's in the floodplain or it's not. That's normally what they do with us. They say, you have to have insurance or you don't. That's really what the whole thing is about, is they want to make sure that the buildings are insured, which they will be insured. FEMA doesn't want to be responsible for hazard from what I've seen in the mortgage industry. That's all I know. It's just what I've seen in the mortgage industry.
Okay, I'm confused by the whole,
Does that make sense? No?
yeah, I'm satisfied, thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. Any other discussion on the second motion?
I think that our question was whether she wanted to go forward, given that she will be required to submit to FEMA. And that's been addressed.
It's been asked and answered. Any other discussion before we vote? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
4. And I vote nay against. Motion carries 4-1. Okay, I will adjourn this meeting. Having no other items on the agenda, I will adjourn the Board of Adjustments meeting at 8:06.